How do we adjust its settings? In ArchiCAD, we have the railing tool, which is often associated with the stair, but we can of course use it separately. So in this case, I want to have a railing around the outside of this big concrete slab. So this is, I would call it an alfresco, so it's an outdoor space for eating. And I'll commonly refer to the railing as a balustrade. So that's the term that we'll often use for that. Now we've looked at previously how to place it, but we haven't really gone into the settings. So I really want to explain that in more detail now. When we go into the railing, up the top, we can use favorites, and these could be favorites that you've created, or these could be favorites from the ArchiCAD library. And the idea is that the railing is the whole thing. The railing is broken up into all of these smaller segments. And so we can see, and this is one of my frustrations, there's too many settings. There's settings and override settings for the whole of the railing, and then there's individual settings for all of the segments. And so when we place a rail, we'll just go through this whole list. When I place a rail, in this case, I'm placing it on the slab level. So I'm placing it at -550, because in this case my slab level is at -550 to this story, and in this case the story is the upper ground floor. In the floor plan display, I can then choose which story I want that to be on. Now generally I'm only ever going to show things on their home story. Stairs are a little bit different to this, because sometimes, well, nearly always, a stair will go from one story to another. Of course, in this case, we've got a little stair that's just going down a couple of steps from here to here. But in this case, in another case like this, we've got a stair that goes the whole way up. So therefore, we might choose to show the railing on multiple stories. In this case, I only want it to be on one. Now I can change the way this works, so I could change it to home story 1 story up, home story 1 story down, and there's heaps more. So I could do a lot of different things with it, and then I can change what it looks like on each one of those stories as well. I can also adjust what we see. Now, of course, the best way to do this, or the preferred way to do this, is by model view options. So effectively that means whatever my model view options are doing, that's what will show. If I untick that, I can then override and choose what's going to be seen. Now, what does it mean by model view options? If we press OK, and then we go to document, we then have model view options, and then down under here, railing options, we can override all of the railing settings. So model view options is effectively overriding the detailed complexity of any architectural elements or 3D elements pretty much in ArchiCAD. We of course also have our graphic override, which can change the way that these look also, but in this case it's just talking about model view options. We'll go back in again. So we're still just in the railing, so we're talking about the whole thing and how to change the representation of the whole thing. Floor plan symbol override. Now this should look very familiar to you. So this is pretty much the same as all the other objects and elements that we can place, and we generally have the ability to override the types of pens. So the line type and the pen type and the fill type. Break line settings. So we can change where that happens, what it looks like, and we can change the representation of the break line as well. And then at the very end we have classifications and properties. So this is all of the details about the rail. I guess we could call it the BIM details, the building information, model information. I generally use this ID a lot, and so I would probably be giving this ID some type of a numeric or alphanumeric system to describe what the railing is, what type it is. Maybe I'd give it a code, and I might also have multiple different types of railings. So apart from this, apart from all of the railing, we of course can change the layer, and it should go on an appropriate layer. What layer will it go on? Well, what is it? I have a layer here called balustrades, and so I'm probably going to put my rail onto layer called balustrade. I also have 2 layers for stairs, external and internal stairs, so I could put it onto that. And I also have layers for fixtures and joinery. And railings or handrails or balustrades sort of also fit into that fixtures and joinery category, so it could also go in there. So there's a few different places that I could be placing in terms of layers where my rail goes. If I break it down, then we have all of the segments. So the segment, so as we can see here, these are the segment elements, and so I can activate them or see them in a couple of different ways. So I can click on it, and so you can see when I click on the element, it'll actually take me to the different segment component. I can also choose to add more or take away from what's already here. So we've got a top rail, so I can take it away. You can't have more than one top rail, right? Because it's top. You can have multiple handrails. You can have a handrail. I currently don't have a handrail. I can choose where that goes. And then I could add another one if I wanted to, and so on. If I don't want it, I'll select it and delete it, select it and delete it. I can do the same thing to edit. So I can select, in this case it's the top rail, and then I go into the settings and I can change this in a few different ways. So firstly, I click on, well, what is the rail? So we could build in a complex profile, and therefore we could use that complex profile. In this case, I'm just using this one called rail 25. And then when I go down into the settings, this is again where there's lots and lots of settings. So this is the rail shape. So we can see that there's all these built-in types. So I can change the shape, I can change the size. In this case, I'm just wanting it to be a steel bar. So it's really good to note that what we're seeing in this window is not scale representative. It's not actually a true scale, it's just symbolic. So don't get too concerned if it doesn't look correct in this view. That's not its purpose. What you can see here is these dashed lines. These dashed lines are representing the extent of the rail. So here in this case, we can see that the bottom line is representing the ground line. This line here on the left is representing basically the end point or the node where we'd place the rail when we start. And we can sort of see a little dashed line through here, and this is representing the top of the rail. So of course, in this case, we want the top of the rail to be at the top. We can see here that there's a segment that's saying that the overall railing would be 1 meter high. So that's saying that the top of this top rail is 1 meter high. Let's keep looking at this. So what's the size of it? So in this case, the depth is 5 millimeters and the width is 50 millimeters. The material, so the building material, what is it made from? If I was going to cut a section through it, that's made of steel, so AED ArchiCAD. So this is a building material that I've made up. I don't need a plate, so I haven't turned that on. I could turn a plate on. I could have fixing on. I don't need either of those, so they're deselected. We can then go into the details of how the fixing works. Distribution of fixing, so the points of fixing. The 2D representation, so remember how we were talking about 2D representation for the whole rail? Now we're looking at the 2D representation for just the top rail. So again, we can override its representation here. And we also have the 3D representation. Now, just check this out. The 2D representation is overriding pens, or representing pens. In this case, it's not the override. This is the base place where we actually set the pens. And then we have the 3D representation, and we also have pens. So it's really important to understand that this one is based on the plans that we see in 2D, so floor plan in this case. This one is the plans that we see in 3D, but of course also when we're producing a section or an elevation, that's also 3D. And so that's what we see here as well. So we change the pens, and we can also change the building material. So in this case, the building material is steel. We talked about that before. The rail surface, in this case, I've got it as AED window and door frame. Why window and door frame? Well, the way that I think about that is, generally speaking, if I've got a project that's got black window and door frame, I'm probably going to have black railings. If I've got a project that's got white aluminium window and door frame, I'm probably going to have a white balustrade. Now that's not always the case, of course, so I could use a different color, but this just means that if, for instance, my client changed their mind and they went from wanting black to white, I could change the material of the doors and windows, of all the different types of doors and windows, as well as all of the different components of the rail, all in one go. And so that's just a little sneaky way that I try to reduce the amount of work I would need to do if something was going to change in a project much further down the track. All right, so that's all just the top rail. Now when we look at handrail or rails, and so here we can have a bottom rail, an inner post. In this case, I haven't added any inner posts. If I add an inner post, I have to then choose where it goes. So I might want to have one at the end. My balusters, let's have a look at the settings here. So the balusters here, this is determining their offset. So how far in from the edge do they start, and how far up or down from the bottom do they start. So these are all saying 0, not because there are none, but because they're all starting at 0. So if I was to change that to 100 millimeters, we'd see that that would make it shorter than the top rail. If I was to make this one 100 millimeters, we'd see that would make that 100 millimeters short of the bottom rail. Now that's a problem, right? We're not saying 100 millimeters short of the ground. So a little bit confusing. We need to make sure we understand how that works. So in this case, I want those both to be 0. Now I can do something like this. If I wanted to have a bottom rail, and then I wanted my balustrades to run all the way through. So let's think we're talking about like a picket fence. I might want my pickets in my picket fence to actually extend above and below the rails. And so that's how we would do that. So in this case, we're saying minus, sort of seems backwards, but in this case, we're saying minus because it's offset. So it's an offset minus of 100 millimeters. Here we can describe the pattern of how that's done. So in this case, we're saying equally distribute the pattern every 90 millimeters. Again, this is just a standard element, so it's built in post, so it's the most basic of all these types, which just means that when we get down to the baluster component setting, I can then change that between a simple rectangle and a simple circle. In this case, I want the steel balusters to be exactly the same as the top. So that's a 50 by 5 millimeter. So that's 5 millimeters wide and 50 millimeters deep. Now we can also add panels. So if we were going to be making a mesh screen or a glass screen, we might want to have a panel instead of balusters. It's not common that we'll have both. It will normally be one or the other. So if I added one, then I need to choose basically where it's going. There we go. There wasn't a space to add it here before. So we've added just a little panel here. So then if I go into the settings, the idea is it's normally based on glass. And so now we're looking at how we might do the fixings for the glass. We're changing the 2D representation and we're changing the 3D representation. So in this case, of course, we might have the panel and we're calling it glass. And then under the panel surface settings, I'd want to make that glass as well. So I've now just added a little bit of glass between the ground and the bottom rail. Of course, I don't really want this. I just did this to show you. If I don't want it, I select it and then I press subtract. And then at the end, so we have segment and then we have nodes. And so under nodes, we can change some of the way that the post or the balustrade ends or runs into each other. So for instance, when we've got it on a corner, how does it deal with corners? When we're having a stair connection, how do we want that relationship to work as well? Generally, we want smooth relationships. And then we can break this down into what is the post. So I can add in posts. what is the connection. I can describe how that works. And ends. So this is basically, if the balustrade ends here, the top rail or the handrail can extend past. So how do I want that end to work? So we can change that between top rail, handrails, and rails. So we can, and we have to edit these all individually. So we see that this handrail is currently set to 200. Now I don't have a handrail at the moment, so it has no impact. But if I did, I'd need to change the settings, otherwise it would show up. So if I select this and look at it in 3D, this is what it looks like. So we see that the bottom's wrong. So we can see here that the bottom rail has been done as a tube instead of a rectangular piece of steel. So let's go back into the setting. We'll find where that was. So we go to rails. We can see that there is only one rail because this one's called a top rail. This bottom one's a rail. I'll go into the settings, rail component settings. We'll change this to the standard rectangular. I don't want it to be hollow in this case. Sometimes it can be a bit confusing which one's 5 and which one's 50. If you're not sure, just try it. So 5 and 50, and then press OK. And we see that was the correct direction. Of course, if we did it the other way around, 5, 55. The problem is, like I said before, this preview window doesn't really tell you. It doesn't show you any different. So the only way to do is to either remember which one's which or try it out. And that will soon show you which way it was supposed to be. I think I forgot to add 50. Go to the 3D surface and make sure it's got the right surface as well. And that's it.